So, welcome to this book launch for Malcolm Saville's Jane's Country Year. I have a copy here. Here it is. Isn't it beautiful? I'm going to introduce the speakers, but first I'm going to do a quick run through of what we're going to be looking at. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. So the first thing is that a brief introduction of Malcolm Saville and the book. And then we're going to be looking a quick roundup of the current publicity about this new edition, which is very exciting for us as publishers. And then Mike McGarry, who was one of the editors of the illustrated bibliography of Malcolm Saville's works, will talk a bit about the book in the context of the rest of Malcolm Saville's works in general. And then Hazel Sheeky Bird from University of Newcastle will talk about Jane's Country Year in the context of children's literature from the 20th century. And this is two covers of her book, which came out about 7 years ago. So that is the quick summary. Speakers, can I first introduce you to Mike McGarry? Mike, could you unmute and say hello so people can see who you are?
Hello, I'm Mike McGarry, and as you said, I was the co-author of the Malcolm Saville Bibliography. I have to say I know a lot more about the books and their publications than what's in them, though I have read most of them, including, of course, Jane's Country Year.
That's great. A bibliographer is a good thing. I'm very keen on bibliography. Thank you. Hazel Sheeky Bird, could you say a few words about what your research has been and how you connect with Malcolm Saville?
Hi there. So I did a PhD at Newcastle University more years ago than I probably care to remember, and I looked at children's fiction from the interwar period. I began looking at Arthur Ransom and concentrated on what I would call camping and tramping novels, or what Victor Watson called camping and tramping novels. And although I wrote in my book that I thought that Saville was doing something quite different, obviously you can't writing about the countryside for children if you don't write about Malcolm Saville. So yeah, that's how I've come to Saville really. So I'm not a Saville scholar. I'm just going to say that straight away to hopefully fend off high expectations about my in-depth knowledge of Saville, but I'm very, very much interested in the general publishing for children during this period, particularly about the countryside. That's me.
Thank you. Graeme Bowerman, could you introduce yourself, please, for those who may not have heard of you before?
Hello, I'm sure nobody's heard of me, but my grandfather illustrated Jane's Country Year, which I have behind me. I have a couple of original proofs. I have a letter dated 1946 from Malcolm to my grandfather, but I never knew my grandfather because he died before I was born. So, and Dad didn't talk about him much. And Dad's not around either now to appreciate this event either. So it's a little bit of a shame, but I'll do my best to introduce you to a couple of items of his artwork.
That's great. Good. Thank you. We'll come to you towards the end of the speaking session. So I think we'll go back to you, Mike. Can you put us in the picture? Where does Jane's Country Year fit into Malcolm Saville's oeuvre?
I think it fits very well into his early work. I've got a few notes here, so I'll go through it.
Yeah.
Stop going on too long. So, but thank you, Kate, for inviting me along. When I heard that Jane's Country Year was going to be published, I was delighted because, like most other Malcolm Saville fans, it's always been a favourite. And it's a delightful book, but it's not one that Saville is most famous for. So a little bit surprised, but very, very welcome. The Malcolm Saville Society has several times followed in Jane's footsteps. We once had an event called Jane's Country Weekend, and another time we had an April Fool joke where we took orders for a spoof publication that was going to be called Jane's Country Cookbook. So you can see that Jane's Country has never been far from our minds. I think the book itself tells you about the publication history of it. It was popular in its time. I noticed that in the Guide magazine, which was a sort of comic for girl guides, they published a whole chapter in that in 1954. Malcolm Saville's first book for children was called Mystery at Witch End, and it came out in 1943. It was very popular, appeared on Children's Hour on the radio and everything, and it sold, I went into umpteen editions. But for the next few years, he alternated. He did write a few of the Lone Pine books, but he also wrote some other things that centered on the countryside and things like that. A couple of scrapbooks were published in 1944 and 1945, which introduced children to the countryside and farming and that sort of thing. And in 1945, he produced a book called Trouble at Townsend, which concerned 2 children who were sent to a farm in the country. And it told about their exploits on that farm, and very similar to what happened to Jane. And also in 1946, he became the editor of My Garden magazine, which was a gardening magazine. It was very popular in its day. And as Malcolm Saville was never a full-time writer, that was his full-time job. So really, on a day-to-day basis, he was dealing with farming and the countryside and flowers and things like that. What I was going to do, and I had a theory about where Moor End Farm is and where the book is set. Malcolm Saville was living at West End Farm in Wheat Hampstead, so I think that's where the book is based. And the area is clearly Harpenden and Wheat Hampstead and West End Farm. The current farmer at West End Farm, where Malcolm Saville lived at this time, is someone called Will Dickinson. And he's actually been through the book very thoroughly and spotted loads of places that are on his farm. Also, the illustration of Moor End Farm looks very much like West End Farm. Briefly going through the book, the town of Crossmarket does feel very much like Harpenden. And there's even a pub in Harpenden called the Marquis of Granbury. The Marquis of Granbury, which does appear in Jane's Country Year. The village where the children go to school is called Townsend, and this was the name of the farm in Trouble at Townsend. And Malcolm Saville's daughter Susan went to school in Townsend Road in Harpenden, so I think we know where he got the name from. There also used to be a flower show in Harpenden. The Statty Fair, which Jane attends, is an annual event in Harpenden and is held in the first week of September, exactly as it's depicted in the book. Malcolm Saville, through Jane, says that he has no idea why it's called Statty Fair, but in fact it was a derivation from statute, and it was originally where agricultural workers were hired. So that was going to be my theory about that. I think that's where the book is set. And then this afternoon, the great Marco Hanlon gave me a 1978 quote from Malcolm Saville, where he says, "I called this farm Moor End, but of course it was West End, my own home." So I think we've actually proved what I was originally going to tell you. The characters within the book are interesting. We have Jane Norris, who was the real Jane, and she was Malcolm Saville's goddaughter. She wasn't christened until she was 12 years old, so she can actually remember what he did at her christening. There's also 2 characters who appear in the book called Rosemary and Susan, and these are the names of Malcolm Saville's own daughters. And I'm confident that maybe he wanted to avoid some jealousy by writing a book about Jane, so he included his own daughters as well. And Malcolm Saville fans will be familiar with some of the other names. There's a Peter, but this time Peter is a boy. There's a Sally, but this time Sally is a dog. And there's a character called Richard. There's also somebody called Smithson. And at this point in Malcolm Saville's career, he introduced a character called Smithson into many of his books and stories. And often they were a villain. In one book, Mr. Smithson steals Susan's ducks when he employs him as a gardener. In another book, a very nasty man comes to sell Mrs. Saville some silk stockings, and that was another a Smithson. And I've also found that there is a Mrs. Smithson in Harpenden about that time, and she was a dressmaker So perhaps they had some problems with one of Mrs. Saville's dresses. The other thing that I think we've all known as members of Malcolm Saville Society and Malcolm Saville fans is that Jane's Country Year was Malcolm Saville's favourite book of all the books he wrote. Actually, when we look at the evidence for that, it's not quite as conclusive as that. He never actually says, this is my favourite book, but he does say things like, authors should not have favourite books, but I am very proud of Jane's Country Year. And he says, Jane's Country Year is one of my favourites. And as I read it again, I believe I like it more than any other book I've ever written. So it is pretty certain this was Malcolm Saville's favourite book. And finally, for me, and I'm sorry if there's any spoilers in this, Jane certainly prospered at Moor End Farm. As the year goes on, we find her going to school, riding a bike, winning a race at the flower show and helping with haymaking. So obviously it worked. And we all come to live with Jane, and I have no apology in saying that I found a tear in my eye this afternoon, actually, when I read the last chapter and when her story comes to an end. And it's great to think that a new generation will be able to join Jane and share her adventures. And I think it's really sad that the real Jane has passed away now. So she can't be with us tonight. And I think she would be really proud of what you've done. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Mike. I'm so sorry. I did not know that the real Jane had died. That is sad news. Well, that's such an interesting introduction to the book, because so much there I had no idea about, because I'm not a member of the Malcolm Saville Society. And actually, this novel by Malcolm Saville is the only one of Saville's I've ever really enjoyed. I just didn't get the others that I tried when I was a child. But this one, my mother she had a first edition from 1946. And so that's why I grew up reading this book and basically knowing it back to front and inside out. And when I came to set up Handheld Press, this book was on my wish list, but I thought, I have to wait. I don't know how to get the rights, And then we decided we have to do it. And it was because I knew the illustrations so well that my designer had a really tough time, because I kept saying, no, that's too dark. Make it lighter, make it lighter. You've lost all the detail in that corner, because look, I have the first edition, I can see. So this book has been a labor of love for me. And my mother is delighted, just so pleased it's come out again, because she adored it as a child, and she was a country girl too. Hazel, can I bring you in now? Can you put us into the picture? How does Jane's Country Year relate to the camping and tramping genre, which is such an interesting genre that you write about in the introduction?
Yeah, no, I can, but actually I wanted to talk about something slightly different this
Do
evening.
jump in, yeah.
Okay. And because I have an admission, because when I've got my notes up as well, so I apologise if you see my eyes flitting backwards and forwards. But I went and I reread the introduction, which I wrote some time ago for this book, because I was very honoured to be asked to write the introduction. And so I really wanted to start what I was going to say today with an admission that I think I got something wrong in that introduction, really. Oh, no. I know, because when I was looking back at it, I realised that one of the very last things that I write in that introduction is that I think that Jane's Country Year is a classic work of children's countryside writing. And in many senses, I think that is absolutely right. Don't jump on me yet. Wait until you hear my punchline, because I think we can definitely draw a line from the Victorian and Edwardian children's books, such as Richard Jefferies' Bevis and John Masefield's A Book of Discoveries, all of which look at quite an unsentimental approach to looking at the countryside and nature observation. There's a clear line to be drawn there, right through the 20th century to the works of Arthur Ransom, but particularly Henry Williamson and G. Bramwell Evans. And really, there's a very clear canon of children's countryside writing that emerges from the 1930s, particularly through into the 1960s. And what Victor Watson coined as camping and tramping novels, those sorts of holiday novels where children engage in lots of pastimes in the countryside. It all forms part of a very definite canon of children's countryside writing. And Jane's Country Year obviously shares many generic features with other books about the countryside that were aimed at children. It has a clear narrative frame that sees essentially an urban child or children transported to the countryside. It's vocalized through their experiences and the growth of this child. And it uses a pupil-mentor dyad as a mechanism by which both, you know, the protagonist and the readers, we all learn about the countryside. All that's clear. But I think the issue that I take with what I wrote, which I think maybe it's always a good thing if you take issue with yourself, is that I think it's probably more accurate to describe Jane's Country Year as a classic work of British mid-century countryside writing, full stop. Just take the word children out of there, because the more I read the introduction, the more I thought about Jane's Country Year again after a slight passage of time. It struck me that the label children's book has a marginalising effect, and it has it on Jane's Country Year and on many other works of countryside writing that were ostensibly aimed for children. And I think that these books are actually, it's more helpful if you see them as belonging to part of a wider canon of writing about about the countryside from this time. And I think that this is important in this, because I think it acts in the same way that Saville's reputation as a writer of genre fiction has allowed critics in the past to avoid really engaging with the significance of Saville's work. I think that's something that's very particular to Saville's novels. And I think it's also something that's happened generally to children's writing about the countryside. And one of the things that we might want to pick up on later is why we think this marginalisation has happened. And in particular, how the marginalisation of writing ostensibly for children about the countryside has really impacted upon what we understand about the sort of discourses around the countryside and national identity and heritage that were really prevalent sort of during those interwar years and continued afterwards. And underpinning a lot of these ideas of national identity, heritage and so on, I guess we could say is the subject of preservation, and that the idea of an essential Englishness and its heritage and traditions, which were obviously important to Malcolm Saville. You know, it predates the 20th century, but it became very prominent during the interwar years and then after the Second World War when Saville's really writing. And I think that it's useful to put Jane's Country Year into this context, into a point in time where preservationist discourses were really quite prominent, and there was a genuine sense of fear that the rapid development that was taking place in some parts of the country was essentially going to lead to a hybridized landscape, one that was neither one thing nor another, not urban, not rural. And, you know, the classic threat was the ribbon developments, you know, derided in those classic works of preservationist literature, such as England and the Octopus. I don't know if anybody's ever seen first edition of that, published in 1928 by Clough Williams Ellis. It literally envisages the ribbon developments as an octopus spreading its arms and its tentacles all over the English countryside. And I think that this context is important. You know, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, which was founded in 1926. And Williams Ellis wasn't a lone voice. Books such as England and the Octopus were overt calls to arms for preservationists. But then we have travel books by writers such as H.V. Morton's In Search of England, very popular works of travelogue. And they helped to create an impression essentially of a beleaguered countryside, and that this countryside, which was the real England, was beset by developers. And and that urban dwellers were increasingly removed, increasingly remote from the countryside. And we add to this, of course, a substantial increase in the numbers of people who, many for the very first time, were actually enjoying increased access to the British countryside. So we have the Youth Hostel Association, formed in 1929, the Ramblers Association in 1935, the Holidays with Pay Act comes in 1938. And, you know, for many people, it's the first time they can genuinely afford holiday. And this led to increased demands for access to leisure facilities and open access in the countryside. And a body of writing really emerges from the 1930s on that seeks to emphasize the significance of the countryside and to challenge the apathy and the lack of understanding of what seemed to be an increasingly urbanized population. And Jane's Country belongs within this body of writing, I believe, because in a gentle way, it reminds readers of the importance of the countryside. And in doing so, it fosters an understanding and a desire to protect it. And, you know, and we could be mistaken, forgiven for missing this if we read Jane's Country Year completely in isolation, because it's a very well written, very gentle, subtle book. But Saville wears his heart on his sleeve elsewhere, doesn't he? And in the Country Scrapbook that Mike just mentioned previously, that's very evident. So I hope you'll indulge me, and I have a very short extract from the foreword to the third edition.
Yeah, do.
That I think is important, because I think it just helps to frame what I feel Saville is very adeptly doing with Jane's Country Year. So the foreword, and I've edited this a little bit, to the Country Scrapbook begins: "It may seem strange to tell you at the beginning of a book about the countryside and wildlife that England is yours, that when you are grown up, you will have to look after her. But this is so because England is one of those countries where the people who live in it have a share in its planning and government. I'm sure you know too that there is no country in the world for which so many sacrifices have been made. All these places are your heritage. They are the Britain for which so many of her sons have fought and died. One day, the countryside will pass into your keeping to guard and cherish in your turn, and it is important to remember that it is very easily spoiled. It's often difficult to love and respect something which we do not know very well, and so I hope that this book will send you out adventuring into the fields, forests and hillsides of our own land, to explore and discover for yourself the unchanging spirit of England, which is not so easy to recognise when it's hidden by bricks and mortar." So we see in that passage overtly some of those discourses, those wider discourses that I've mentioned already, that idea of an essential Englishness that's rooted in the landscape, that's connected to the sacrifices of war, the idea that this landscape is a repository of heritage that's passed from one generation to the next, and a concern that modern children are becoming disconnected from this, which of course goes for adults too. We just need to think about Jane's mother. And then there's that final sense that this is in imminent danger of being built over. Now, the Country Scrapbook, as you will all know, is a very different book to Jane's Country Year. But I'd argue that their aims are very similar, they just take different forms. So in the introduction, I quoted Geoffrey Treece, in the introduction to the new edition rather, I've quoted Geoffrey Treece, and he describes a novel as didactic fiction. And I feel that this is a really helpful description of the book, because ostensibly Jane's Country Year is a vehicle for teaching the readers as well as Jane about nature observation, rural customs, life on the farm the whole year round. But it wants to teach them far more than this. It wants to teach them to understand and to care about the countryside, and through caring about it, to want to protect it. And really, in seeking to educate children about the countryside, what Saville's doing is really fostering a sense of civic responsibility, a sense of wanting to protect the countryside. And so Jane's Country Year arguably does belong alongside that body of work of mid-20th century preservationists. So if we think about Williams Ellis again, in England and the Octopus, he makes a very specific overt link between children's education and the preservation of the countryside. Only rather than approaching them through their recreational material like Saville does, instead Williams Ellis says that schoolmasters and mistresses should teach children the right way to behave in the countryside, and that preservationist principles can be taught by stealth under headings of housing, population, town planning, and so on. And so he too is arguing essentially for the cultivation of civically engaged children. Likewise, the idea of inheritance and heritage that Saville invokes in that foreword to the Country Scrapbook, that there's a responsibility for the countryside's protection that passes from one generation to the next. This is a recurring motif in British writing of the time, and H.B. Morton opens In Search of England with a very similar observation, and he says that essentially handing on the countryside as well as its heritage and the monuments to the past is a sacred duty. And so arguably, I think that we can see Saville taking up this duty in Jane's Country Year. And you know, there really was a wealth of books produced for both adults and child audiences that explored this idea of heritage, duty and countryside. And I think that this is where Jane's Country Year sits, to be honest. And in terms of writing for adults, a very typical example, you could take the anthology Our Nation's Heritage, which I looked at again for the first time in a long time, edited by J.B. Priestley, who of course made his own famous journey through England in the 1930s. Our Nation's Heritage is published in 1939 and is divided into very similar sections to the Country Scrapbook. We have sections on farming, nature, only for the adult audience. There's also sections on nostalgia. And the book both celebrates British countryside and rural life in general, and it warns of the threats against it. And in the epilogue to his book, which is entitled Britain is in Danger, Priestley writes that there have been two periods that have jeopardised the landscape, the countryside of England. The first was the Industrial Revolution, and the second is the 1920s and 1930s. And he writes that arguably the development of the 1920s and 30s has been much more harmful because it's been haphazard and widespread, whereas the development during the Industrial Revolution was in very specific pockets. And I think it's easy to overlook what we could term really are the preservationist aims of Jane's Country Year if we don't situate the book within its wider context, both in terms of Saville's other writing about the countryside and that wider canon of writing.
Mm-hmm.
But I would really argue, and I'm finishing up, don't worry, but I would say that the absence of Jane's Country Year from that canon, that wider canon, it really diminishes our understanding of the ways in which writers really saw children as integral participants in the protection of the countryside, as civically engaged individuals, akin arguably to young climate activists of today. You know, we can sometimes see these books as calls to arms to protect what people felt was important. And it also diminishes, you know, our understanding of the importance of the writing for children in that wider body and that wider canon of writing about the countryside as a whole from the middle of the 20th century. And yeah, thank you. That's me done.
Thank you. That was terrific. Very, very interesting.
It wasn't about camping and tramping books.
No, not at all. But
that's what you
maybe
wanted.
somebody will ask a question about that later. We're going to move on to Graeme now. Graeme Bowerman, can you give us a brief outline of your grandfather's work as far as you understand it? And then maybe tell us about that letter and then show us some pictures.
Yeah, a little bit, I guess. He liked to paint boats and did a lot of work around the Thames area, Limehouse Link area. He was a member of the Whopping group of artists, so that sort of area features quite a lot in his works. There's a bit of still life. Later on, a bit later in his career, he was involved in a few architectural projects. So what we see now as CGI images for buildings, etc., obviously were carried out by artists of the time. So I've got some works here that have been done for lighting contractors to show lighting schemes and how lighting schemes will work in department stores. Certainly wasn't just the illustrations you see in the book. It's a very narrow part of his work, but that style of illustration is quite prominent in the way he worked as well.
Yeah. Do you know how he got the commission?
Sorry?
Do you know how he got the commission to illustrate Jane's Country Year?
Yes, I do. There's a letter about that too.
Yay! Tell us all.
Well, he had a very good friend. There's a lot of written correspondence between him and a very good friend, another artist called Walter Spradbury, who also resided in Buckhurst Hill. And I understand from the letter, Walter was contacted in regard to illustrating the book, and then recommended Bernard to illustrate the book instead of him. And then I have letter correspondence between publisher and Bernard, and how much he charged to do the work, which is an interesting figure considering the date. And again, like I said, the letter between Malcolm and to Bernard as well.
Mm-hmm. How long is the letter from Saville to Bernard? Is it
not very long at all? Literally a small page, slightly less than A4.
Do you think you could read it out?
Yes, I had a read. I'll try and do it again. There's a couple of words that obviously fountain pen from 46 is a little bit, but yeah, it has a West End farmhouse, Wheathampstead letterhead.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we can see that. Yeah. Oh, yes, very nice. Yeah.
Okay, so my dear Bowerman, I do want you to know how much we all appreciate and enjoy the picture you so kindly gave us. We have had a lot of people in and out of this house the last few days, and all have admired it tremendously. It was very good again to remember us in this way, and I like the inscription on the back very much also. Here is the farming year, which I believe you wanted to borrow again. You are welcome, but please be certain to return it. Sorry. We all hope you all have had a very happy Christmas and wish you and yours a happy and prosperous 1947. I hope we shall be associated on another book before long. Sincerely, Malcolm Saville. And that's dated 29th of December 1946.
Right. So after Jane's Country Year had come out.
So after the book had come out.
Yeah.
I guess there was a gift for the illustration work in the form of a painting, which I don't know if that still exists. Whether somebody could tell me that painting still exists, that would be great. And then there's various correspondences here between George Nunes Limited.
Wow. Yeah.
Publisher, and that's typed correspondence. So that's from February 46 through to this December 45, and then January 46. There's Bernard's letter outlining his costs.
How much did he charge then? I don't think we can see the detail.
He charged one whole page, black and two colours, was £8 and 8 shillings. And so I think it became, there's a total per chapter of £21. So total, and including the wrapper design, £260. So
well, I never.
In 1946.
That's quite a lot.
A fair bit of money, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Very good.
There, so yes, and there's the letter outlining the correspondence from Walter saying that George Newnes had been in touch regarding illustrating a book. So yeah, it's a nice little bit of documentation for the era and for the So
that's really interesting publishing history as well as art history.
a little bit, yes,
As a publisher, the production process the readers don't usually bother about, but it's something publishers have to pay a lot of attention to. Can you tell us about the artwork you've got sitting in the back behind you?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah. So I have, that's a very unfinished piece, which at the bottom is inscribed Apple Blossom, Jane's Country Year in quotes, dated 46. So whether that was used, I think there were some smaller pictures in the second edition, in the back of one of the second edition or the third edition of the book, where there were some sort of smaller pictures.
Yeah, Kim, could we bring you in on this, please? Because you might know about this. Yeah.
No, I'm afraid that's not my area expertise. I can see Amanda's got her hand up. I'm wondering if she's about to add to something.
Yeah, do please. If you.
Not about this, not about what you just said, but my grandparents had a painting of West End Farm, which came to my father and my mother still has. And I'm wondering if that's the painting that your grandfather did, Graeme. Maybe. I don't know who painted it.
Yeah, maybe.
But it's a watercolour of West End Farm, which has always been in the family. So it's hanging on my mother's wall now.
Oh, maybe that is. I'll check bottom right or bottom left and see if it's got Bernard Bowerman written on it.
It is. I can confirm
I'll
that,
have a look.
Amanda. Yeah, it is. It definitely is that one.
That's great news.
Oh, lovely. Oh, okay. I'll be intrigued as to what the inscription is on the back then.
Yeah, it's quite a detailed inscription, isn't it, Amanda?
Can't say I've ever looked at the inscription, Mark.
Okay, interesting. Good. Oh, lovely. That's nice to see it around. And
it's very nicely presented. It's actually in a double-sided frame, so when it's actually removed from the wall, it's got the inscription visible on the back. So it's very nicely done.
Okay. Oh, lovely.
Clearly a treasured piece, as Amanda says.
I'm going to my mum this weekend, so I'll have a look.
Oh yeah, check it out. Great.
Yeah, it'll be good. And get back to me, Amanda, and I'll put you and Graeme in touch if you want to send information. Oh, they look familiar.
Yeah. So I've got, so they're obviously on a mounted board. One missing, I think. So.
Oh, that's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
And then that one so I have this one here.
Yeah.
Here in the top is Bernard actually doing one of the illustrations.
Oh, that's terrific.
You can see the illustration on the desk in front of him.
Yeah.
These two, I think that's front cover, isn't it?
Yeah, the front cover, and then the October scene of her cycling down the hill, which has already been picked up. There's a video blogger called Eric Anderson, who has trailed Jane's Country Year for his reads for January, and he picked out that October illustration, and he has 21,000 followers. So 21,000 people have seen that picture now, which is quite nice.
Yeah. So yeah, and the inscription is illustrations by Bernard Bowerman, Jane's Country Year, the main illustration for January, final touches to the above, and photographed by Trevor Gladwell, and the main illustration for October. Yes, so. Those, and then there's a few others around of some local bits just to show his versatility. He also pencil drew my father as a 2-year-old. So I don't know how they are, but pencil sketches of my dad at 9 p.m. on April the 8th, 1945.
Goodness, right.
And but the style is obviously very was much practiced by him. He that style, that sketch style, and that lino cut style.
Yeah, it's the lino cut. It's so distinctive. It's absolutely beautiful. Yeah.
I've certainly seen old books in my parents' loft which have illustrations by other lino cutters and lino cut style illustrations. So
okay. Well, that was terrific, Graeme. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back, do screen share again, because I'm going to show you some of the publicity we've had. So in the top left-hand corner, as I'm looking at it, we've got this green cover. This is the Church Times of December. They used the Christmas image quite cheekily, I thought. They did a very, very small review, but they used the cover, Malcolm Saville cover. That was really nice. This large double-page spread with the orange header, this is something that Kim Spencer of the Saville Society contributed to. This was in the Shropshire magazine, and I think they did an absolutely beautiful job showcasing the art and Kim's piece about reading Jane's Country Year. And then on the bottom left, we have a one-page long extract from the novel, which I placed in the Booksellers Association magazine Book Time, which should be in many bookshops, so you might be able to see that. Right, I think now we should go to questions. Is there anyone who's got questions to ask of any of our speakers? I think it's best if you do. Could you type it in the chat, and then we will read them out and get people to answer. So please don't be shy. While we're waiting, I want to kick off with Mike. Can we go back to you? Do you happen to know why the second edition was made with the extended annotations about nature that Graeme mentioned that we had an illustration from?
In a word, no. And I was disgusted to find when I went through my Malcolm Saville connection that somehow over the years I've lost both the second and third editions of Jane's Country Year. So I'm just left with the first edition and the paperback. And now, of course, your wonderful edition to add to it. That's a long-winded way of saying no, I don't.
Okay. Does anyone else in the Saville Society happen to know why we had the sort of the almost didactic second edition with the learn more about nature bits at the end of each chapter? I've only glimpsed at a couple of images online. I've never actually seen the second edition. I've only got the first. Doesn't look like it. No? Okay, maybe somebody will come through later. We have a question from Eva Jane, who I think is in USA. Was Mr. Bowerman influenced by Japanese woodblock prints when he created his illustrations? What do you think, Graeme?
I'd a guess, like I said at the beginning, I'm not well versed in grandfather's influences, but I would have thought so. Yes, it was a favoured style of his, so yeah, he could well have been influenced. By that, yes.
Okay, thank you. Linda asks, could I ask our speakers what the countryside means to them and how far Jane's Country Year evokes their opinion? So, Hazel, can we go to you about that?
What does the countryside mean to me? Oh gosh, that is a really tough question, Linda. Really tough. It depends. It depends on whether or not I'm with my small children or not. That's the honest truth. If I'm not with my children, then the countryside means space and calm and solitude. And if I am with my children, it means camping and tiredness and chaos. And so the countryside means different things to me depending on who I'm enjoying the countryside with. I never go to the countryside alone though, so that's something to think about. That yeah, I've never explored the countryside alone. I've always gone with somebody else, and it's interesting because actually Jane spends quite a lot of time, doesn't she, in the novel? She has friends that she explores with, but she also has a lot of time to run and enjoy the countryside herself, which is something that I've never had that advantage, that opportunity to explore. So yeah, it means different things to me. But I grew up in Bradford. When you read the sort of 1930s, 40s, 50s, right? I'm from the dark satanic mill country. That's where I'm from, really. So the countryside is yeah, I spent a lot of time in it, but it never feels like my space. Yeah. So
thank you. Right. Mike, what about you?
Can I just say that the one thing that Malcolm Saville does is introduce people to the countryside. And I'm actually sitting now less than a mile away from where Wish End, that Malcolm Saville wrote about. And when you come to Shropshire, unlike any other part of the country, Malcolm Saville is very well known here. And if I've spoken to one person here who said, the reason I live in Shropshire and enjoy the countryside around here is because I read Malcolm Saville books when I was a kid. If I've met one, I've met 50 or 100. It is actually unbelievable. The country around here is beautiful, and Malcolm Saville introduced so many people to it.
Thank you. Graeme, what about you?
My parents lived in the countryside, lived in a very small hamlet just outside a village in Essex. So I grew up surrounded by open fields and 2 or 3 houses. So yeah, countryside just means childhood memories and open space, playing with my mates, cycling down the road, you know, all sorts of stuff. I played cricket for the local village team, which was a village green in the middle of the small village. Yes, just nice, peaceful memories, really, when roads were quieter and you could cycle a long way and nobody was worried about you and you didn't have a mobile phone to track you down or anything.
Yeah. I didn't grow up anywhere in England. I grew up in the northeast of Scotland, so my countryside is the Cairngorm Mountains, which are a wee bit different from what Malcolm Saville wrote about. I do remember being seriously put off the Lone Pine adventures because of all the cycling. It was so much cycling, going up and down hill and bicycles without gears. No way. That was not something that would appeal to me ever. I'm a walker, not a cycler, although I do have a bike. Are there any other questions? Ah, yes. Graeme, I will have to put you in touch with the Malcolm Saville Society newsletter because they want to publish you. I will do that later.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just say, I'm the editor for the next magazine, which is full, but if they want to send anything to editor at, then do so. And we will include anything that people send that's worth reading.
Right, thank you for that. Amanda, could I ask, what your mother and your siblings, how do you regard Jane's Country Year? Is it something that you enjoyed much when you were a child?
My father is Malcolm's oldest son. We read it. I mean, we read nearly all his books because he gave them to us for our birthdays and for Christmas. He was very fond of Jane's Country Year. Yeah, my mum didn't until she met my father. She was a very keen fan in her own right of Papa's books, so she always read his books when she was a child as well. So, and all her sisters did. So we all grew up reading them. And he was extremely fond of Jane's Country Year. I remember him talking to me about it when I was little.
Thank you. We got a long comment about, yes, Hazel and Pam are discussing about Jane's Country Year. Is it camping and tramping or not? There's obviously a lot to talk about there. And then there's another one. Are there any other questions? Questions for Graeme or for Hazel or for Mike? In fact, is there anyone? I know there's 1 or 2 people not from the Malcolm Saville Society who are here, but there might be others. No? Okay. I think then we will wrap this up, but please don't go. Oh, Hazel, sorry.
I have a quick question for the members of the Malcolm Saville Society in that I've been working in the 7 Stories archive, and my last job I was cataloguing the papers of Aidan and Nancy Chambers, and Aidan Chambers had a long correspondence with Malcolm Saville that spanned many years, and there's a big file of correspondence in the Aidan Chambers archive between himself and Malcolm Saville, and I just wondered if that was a relationship that was something that members of the society were aware of, or if you were aware that that correspondence was there, and if that would be of interest to you. I just thought I'd flag up that it exists and that it's there in the 7 Stories archive in Newcastle, if that's of any interest, because I think the correspondence spans about 10 years, and it's quite a significant amount. So I just thought I'd mention that in case it was of interest to anybody. While you're here, captive, so to speak.
We will, yeah, connections will be made. Right, we're going to wrap this up, but don't go away, because after the recording is finished, there will be more to tell you.